Veridia had been on the galactic community's maps for 3 centuries, and in its awareness for considerably less time, because there was nothing about the colony that warranted attention. No mineral deposits of commercial interest. No position along any strategic route. No political ambitions expressed through diplomatic channels. The humans who had settled there had chosen the planet for reasons that made sense only to people who valued the quality of afternoon light through a particular kind of tree, or the way a river sounds when it has been moving through soft hills long enough to have found its own pace. They farmed. They raised children. They made things, paintings mostly, and occasionally music, though the music they made was the kind that required quiet to fully hear. The Kryth Empire reached Veridia the way it reached every world it intended to acquire, which was with a single warship sent ahead to receive the submission that always preceded the formal annexation. The warship arrived and broadcast the standard demand and received nothing in return. Not a refusal, not a counteroffer, not even a signal that the demand had been received, though the broadcast frequencies were functional and the planet was clearly inhabited. Kryth, commanding from his flagship, interpreted the silence as either ignorance or incapacity and ordered a landing party to explain the situation in person. The landing party found empty villages and quiet fields and the work that had been left mid-task, as though everyone had simply stepped away for a moment. In the center of a vast plain, visible from orbit, a single word had been plowed into the earth in characters large enough to read from space. They reported it to Kryth. He read it and laughed. That night every ship in the fleet went dark simultaneously, without warning, without any detected cause. No weapons had fired. No one had signaled distress. The silence that Veridia had been practicing for 3 centuries had simply expanded to include them. The flagship recovered power after 6 hours, which was 4 hours longer than the engineering team's most pessimistic estimate for a total system failure of unknown origin. And when the systems came back, they came back fully, which eliminated the explanations that involved damage. Nothing was broken. Nothing had been removed or altered. The fleet had been switched off and then switched on again by something that had left no trace of itself in any diagnostic the engineers could run. The crew's reports were consistent in the way that reports are consistent when everyone has experienced the same thing and has been separately interviewed before being allowed to compare notes. Every crew member described the same 6 hours, not unconscious, not absent, but present in a specific and uncomfortable way. The feeling of being observed from a direction that had no physical source. The sense that whatever was observing was not cataloging them as threats or resources or obstacles, but as something more difficult to be cataloged as choices, as the sum of choices made and unmade across years. Kryth dismissed this as the psychological residue of a frightening event and ordered the bombardment to proceed. The targeting systems reported ready. The firing commands were issued through the correct channels. Nothing discharged. The systems were online, and the commands were logged, and the weapons did not fire. A signal rose from the planet's surface, not a transmission that the communication array could decode, but a vibration that arrived through the hull itself, through the structure of the ships and the bones of the crew. It carried no data. It carried only what it carried, which was the quality of being heard, not by something that was gathering information, but by something that had already gathered enough. Kryth felt the quality of it reach him and felt, for the first time in a career built on the application of overwhelming force, that he was the one who had been found insufficient. The retreat was not the word Kryth used in his report, but it was the accurate word for what the fleet did, moved away from Veridia with the specific haste of people who are not afraid of the thing they are moving away from and are afraid of themselves in the presence of it. The jump to the outpost took 8 hours, and the crew spent most of those hours not speaking, which was unusual for Kryth crews, who were trained to maintain operational chatter as a discipline against the psychological isolation of deep space. They had found a different kind of isolation and were sitting inside it. The High Command's incredulity was professional and brief. They had received stranger reports, and the hum recordings that accompanied this one were sufficient to produce, in every listener, a version of what the crew had described, which converted incredulity into something more productive. They sent Thessa because Thessa was the person they sent when the situation required understanding something before deciding what to do about it. She landed in fields that were not abandoned. The colony had simply continued, which was the detail that stayed with her longest afterward. The gardens being tended, the children playing, the old people occupying their porches with the unhurried attention of people who have been sitting in the same light for decades and have not yet finished enjoying it. The young woman who approached her had the calm of someone who had known she was coming. Thessa sat for the hour of silence with the discomfort of someone who did not practice silence and found it, in this company, impossible to fill with anything sufficient. When the woman spoke, it was to say the thing that the hour had been preparing Thessa to hear. The hum did nothing. It reflected. The shame that Vorkutha's fleet had felt was not imposed from outside, but recognized from inside, recognized in the way that shame arrives when you see yourself clearly rather than as you prefer to be seen. The humans had not built a weapon. They had built the conditions under which the Kryth could see what they had been doing. That, the woman said, was the whole of it. Thessa composed her report with the care of someone who understood that the document would be read by people who wanted a different conclusion and who would look for any weakness in the argument as a reason to dismiss it. She gave them nothing to find. The report was precise, and its logic was sequential, and its conclusion was the only one the evidence supported. Veridia had no military assets. No weapons systems, no defensive installations, no soldiers in any configuration. What it had was a field that did not attack but responded, a resonance that interacted with the moral history of whoever entered it and reflected that history back with a clarity that the Empire's most advanced interrogation techniques had never produced in any subject. The High Command's fury at this description was itself a form of confirmation, though she did not say this in the report. She said it in the room, because the room required it, and she had nothing left to lose by accuracy. Concepts, she told them, were not targetable. You could not aim a bombardment at a conscience. You could not outmaneuver a mirror. The only available responses were understanding or continuous failure, and the continuous failure would continue for as long as the fleet entered the sector, because the sector's effect on the fleet was not a malfunction to be repaired, but a relationship to be reckoned with. They withdrew. The formal declaration came with the bureaucratic language of strategic repositioning, and the Veridia sector was marked off limits in charts that were not to be discussed, and the Empire moved its attention elsewhere. But the hum did not require proximity to persist. It had entered the ships and the crews and traveled with them back into the Empire's territory, and it persisted there as a memory persists, not loudly, not constantly, but available whenever the conditions were quiet enough to hear it. The Empire had discovered what the humans of Veridia had known from the beginning. Of all the things a civilization could deploy against an enemy, memory lasted longest. The news traveled at the speed of stories that confirmed something people already suspected was possible, faster than official channels, carried in the accounts of the Kryth crews who had been there, and the diplomat who had reported it, and the secondary sources who had spoken to both. Every species that received the story processed it through its own framework and arrived at different conclusions, but the common element across the conclusions was curiosity. Veridia was now on every map as a place worth understanding. The delegations that arrived were received according to a logic that outsiders found difficult to interpret. Some were welcomed immediately. Others waited at the orbital approach for days before receiving permission to land. A few were turned away without explanation, and the ones turned away were generally the ones who had traveled with the most equipment and the clearest intentions to extract something. Those who arrived with less purpose tended to be received more readily. Ilara came with instruments that represented the most sensitive detection technology her field had produced, and she found nothing that the instruments could register, which was itself a significant finding that her training did not give her the framework to fully interpret. She asked to speak with the woman who had received Thessa, and Mira agreed, and answered the question Ilara had been building toward since the instruments returned their null results. The hum was not a thing in the world. It was what happened between the world and the person in it. You could not separate those two elements and measure either one in isolation. For the same reason you could not measure a friendship by weighing two people individually. The year on Veridia was not what Ilara had designed it to be, which was the condition that made it what it became. She had arrived with a research protocol and a timeline, and the expectation that extended observation would produce the data that the instruments had failed to detect. The protocol dissolved within the first month, not because she abandoned it, but because the environment made its premises irrelevant. You could not observe the hum from outside the relationship. You had to be in the relationship, which meant the observer was also the subject, which meant the methodology she had brought did not apply. What she experienced across the year was not orderly, and was not comfortable, and was also the most honest she had been with herself in several decades of professional life. The hum showed her things she had learned to route around, regrets that had been filed and not processed, fears that had been managed rather than examined, small choices across years that she had framed at the time as reasonable and that looked different in the hum's reflection. The weeping that came from this was not the weeping of someone who had been attacked. It was the weeping of someone who had been seen accurately for the first time in a long while, and who found the accuracy to be a relief even when its content was difficult. She planted the glowing seeds in a plot behind the house she had been given, and they grew in Veridia's soil with the unconcerned abundance of things that have found conditions that suit them. She had come looking for answers, and had found instead an orientation toward questions, not as problems requiring solutions, but as the natural state of a mind that has stopped pretending to know more than it does. The scientists who followed Alara came with their own instruments and their own protocols and experienced the same sequence she had experienced, compressed into shorter time frames because they had the advantage of her accounts to calibrate their expectations. Most of them left. Leaving was not a failure. The hum showed each person what they were ready to see, and readiness varied, and some people arrived at Veridia in a configuration that required more preparation before the hum's reflection could be useful rather than simply destabilizing. They would return, or they would not, and either was the right choice for the particular person making it. Kale arrived with his recorder and his established reputation for exposing comfortable fictions, and found nothing to expose, which was the kind of outcome that honest journalists recognize as the story rather than the absence of one. He sat for 3 days in the same field where Thessa had first felt the judgment that was not a judgment, and on the 4th day he wrote something that was not what he had come to write and was more accurate than what he had intended. The poem moved through the galaxy's communication networks with the specific velocity of things that name something people have been feeling without having the language for it. Millions recognized the experience of being heard without anyone speaking. Thousands traveled to find it. The Kryth watched the tide from behind the barrier they had built from avoidance, and found that avoidance was not the same as absence. The silence was not staying on Veridia. It was traveling outward in the accounts of everyone who visited, accumulating in the galaxy's shared awareness, and there was no engineering solution to a spreading quality of attention. The decree was issued with the full apparatus of Kryth legal authority, and announced with the seriousness of an administration that had decided the only remaining option was to make the problem officially not exist. Every record of Veridia in the Imperial Archives was reclassified. Every crew member who had been in the sector was counseled on the consequences of further disclosure. The cartographers were instructed to remove the planet from all navigational databases, and they did so, and the removal was technically complete and practically meaningless because the stories were already distributed too widely to be recalled. Thessa had returned to her position after submitting her report, and had been watched since her return with the specific attention that institutions pay to people who have said something the institution wished had not been said. She did not speak publicly. She spoke in the ordinary spaces of private life, over meals, in the company of people she trusted, in the gradual accumulation of conversations that had no individual weight and a collective weight that the surveillance apparatus was not designed to detect. The whispers that spread through the Empire had the quality of things that grow in the dark precisely because the dark is their natural environment. Forced silence and chosen silence produce different results in the same way that a wall and a garden were both structures made of the same materials and existed in completely different relationships to the life around them. The Empire's imposed quiet was a container. Veridia's quiet was a growing condition. From inside the container, the growing reached them anyway. The fall took decades, which was faster than the empires the Kryth had absorbed had fallen, and slower than the people who had suffered under Kryth rule had hoped for, and both of these facts were true simultaneously without contradicting each other. It was not armies that produced the fall. There was no single event that historians could point to as the moment the empire became something else. There was instead the accumulation of a question that the hum had planted in every Kryth who had passed through the sector, or heard the recordings, or spoken with Thessa, or spoken with someone who had spoken with Thessa. The question did not announce itself. It arrived in the quiet moments, in the intervals between occupation and distraction, and once it had arrived it did not leave. What have you done? Thessa spent the decades teaching in the spaces the Empire's crumbling authority left open, and her teaching was not ideological in any conventional sense. She did not argue that conquest was wrong, because argument about moral conclusions tends to produce defensiveness rather than examination. She described what the hum did and what it had done to her and what the examination it produced had led her to do with her life, and she answered questions, and the cumulative effect of the teaching was that people began to sit with the question rather than routing around it. The Kryth who came out the other side of that sitting freed the people they had enslaved. They returned the worlds they had taken. They paid what they owed, which took the rest of the century, and was not complete when Thessa died, but was continuing when her students took over and continued after them. Veridia's humans watched this from their fields. They planted their gardens. They raised their children in the particular unhurried way of people who understood that what they had done was already done, and the rest was not their work to manage. The other empires processed the Kryth's transformation with the specific quality of attention that large institutions pay to the unexpected collapse of a peer, close, searching, motivated by the fear that whatever had happened to the Kryth might be communicable. Their delegations to Veridia were dressed in the language of diplomatic interest and motivated, variously, by the hope of acquiring the hum as a tool, the desire to understand it as a threat, and in a few cases the simple curiosity of individuals who had read Kale's poem and wanted to know if what it described was real. Veridia received them as it received everyone. The fields were the same fields. The silence was the same silence. The hum did not distinguish between delegations sent with strategic intent and individuals who arrived with genuine openness, because it did not engage with intent. It engaged with what was actually present, which sometimes aligned with intent, and sometimes revealed that the intent was covering something else. The Zarth ambassador had been sent with a specific brief and arrived with the professional confidence of someone who had operated in difficult diplomatic environments for 30 years and understood himself well enough to function effectively in them. The hum showed him what 30 years of effective professional function had been built on top of. He sat with that for several days. When he came back out of the sitting, the brief was no longer relevant to him. He returned home changed in the specific way of someone who has seen clearly something they cannot unsee, and the clarity reorganized everything that had been arranged around the unseeing. His subsequent career was built entirely on the reorganization. He credited Veridia each time he was asked, and he was precise about what he credited it with, not teaching, not wisdom, not any content that could be attributed to the planet or its people. Just the sitting, just the silence, just the fact that someone had been willing to be present with him while he looked. A century of pilgrimage had not made Veridia louder. It had made it more various, which was a different thing. The original human settlers' flowers grew alongside the bioluminescent blooms the Verge had planted and the low spreading ground cover from the Zarth homeworld and a dozen other species' contributions, and the mixture had produced a garden that was coherent not because it had been planned, but because the hum seemed to accept everything that arrived in genuine rather than instrumental spirit, and genuine arrivals tended toward coherence regardless of their origin. Lyra arrived in the condition that the hum was least and most useful for, which was the condition of someone who wants something specific and has decided the wanting is justified. She wanted a weapon. She had a clear target for it and a history that made the target understandable. She sat in the garden, and the hum did what the hum did, which was not give her the weapon but show her the wanting, the particular texture of the rage that the wanting was made of, and beneath the rage the grief that the rage was covering, and beneath the grief the love that had made the grief possible in the first place. She wept for days in the way people weep when they have been carrying something for a long time and have finally put it down somewhere safe enough to feel the full weight of what they were carrying. The hum did not tell her what to do with what she felt. It held the space while she felt it. When she stood up, she knew what she needed to do, which was not what she had come to find, and was the right answer anyway. She planted seeds from her mother's garden in Veridia's soil and stayed to tend them. The Galactic Council's invitation was extended with the ceremony appropriate to a world that had, without any apparent effort or intention, reshaped the political landscape of a significant portion of the galaxy. The response they received was brief and was delivered through an ordinary citizen who happened to be in the orbital approach at the time, which was typical of how Veridia communicated with formal bodies, not through designated representatives, because Veridia had none, but through whoever was available when the communication was needed. The humans were not interested in speaking for the galaxy. They had the mirror. The galaxy had itself. The connection between those two things was the entirety of what Veridia offered, and representing that connection as a political position would misrepresent it into something it was not. The council sat with this response for a while, in the way that deliberative bodies sit with responses that do not give them anything to negotiate with. Sarah arrived at Veridia in the days before the vote that would determine the next several years of her career, and she sat in the garden with the specific quality of attention of someone who is hoping the garden will tell them what to do. The garden did not tell her what to do. It showed her what she was doing, and why she was doing it, and what the why was made of. She returned to the chamber and cast the vote that the sitting had revealed was the accurate one, and she lost the election by a margin that her analysts described as avoidable, and she did not find this as devastating as she had expected it to be. She became a teacher because teaching was what came naturally after finding yourself, and she taught the only thing she actually knew, which was what the hum had shown her, which was herself. The gardens had been expanding for generations by the time the continent scale maps began to feel accurate, and even then the maps were always slightly behind, because new arrivals kept planting, and the planted things kept spreading into the spaces between the deliberate plantings. And Veridia's soil accepted all of it with the unconcerned generosity of ground that has been tended carefully for long enough to become genuinely fertile. The hum extended its range gradually in the way that living things extend their range when their conditions are right, and by the time the 2nd century of pilgrimage began, it could be felt at the system's edge before any ship had broken atmosphere. The Kryth who built the monument did not ask permission, which was consistent with the spirit in which it was built. They came in a small delegation with materials and a design they had worked on collectively for several years, and they worked quietly for 3 weeks, and when it was done they sat with it for a day and then departed. The statue was a being in the posture of someone who has stopped. Head down, hands open, knees on the ground. Not defeated. Stopped. The plaque said what the experience had actually been, without embellishment. The humans planted more flowers. They added a section representing the Kryth homeworld alongside the others, a deep red bloom that the Kryth ambassador had sent seeds for years earlier in an unofficial package with no accompanying note. The garden had accepted them. The child who asked the elder about armies was asking the right question and received the right answer, which was that armies belonged to the era before the learning, and Veridia had been in the era of the learning for 3 centuries now, and expected to continue for as long as there was soil to tend and silence to tend it in. The council's proposal moved through the standard deliberative process, and emerged changed in the ways that proposals always emerge changed from deliberation, smaller than the original vision, more carefully worded, and more likely to survive contact with the various constituencies whose cooperation was required for implementation. The Day of Silence, as finally ratified, was a single day per galactic standard year, voluntary in participation, with a formal recommendation from the Council and no enforcement mechanism, because the humans of Veridia had been consulted during the drafting process and had declined to participate in any version that included enforcement. The first day produced the chaos that voluntary observance of unfamiliar practices tends to produce, and the species that ignored it were the majority, and the ones that mocked it were vocal, and the ones that participated did so quietly enough that their participation was not widely visible on the day itself. What was visible in the weeks following were the accounts, individual, various, uncoordinated, of what the participation had felt like. The accounts did not agree in detail and agreed completely in character. People had stopped performing, even briefly, and in the stopping had encountered something that the performing had been covering. Elias had been asked the question enough times that he had a considered answer, but he continued to think about it each time he gave the answer, because it was the kind of question that stayed alive rather than being resolved by answering it. Silence was full, he said. This was the thing that people who had not experienced it consistently misunderstood. They expected absence and found presence, themselves, the people they were with, the universe conducting its ordinary business in the background of all the noise they usually generated. Permission to stop generating the noise was what the day provided. The permission was the gift. The silence was just what was already there. Mira had been the first human to speak to a Kryth, which was a distinction she had never sought and had worn lightly across the century and a half that followed. She had continued doing what she had always done, sitting with people in the fields, tending her garden, answering questions with questions when the question being asked was one that the asker needed to sit with rather than be answered. She had watched the Empire change and the galaxy change and Veridia change around the core of its silence, which had not changed because the silence was not a thing that changed but a condition that either was or wasn't, and Veridia's had been for 3 centuries now. The funeral gathering was the largest in Veridia's history, and the quietest gathering of that size the galaxy had produced in any context. They came because she had sat with them, one by one across 150 years, and the sitting had mattered to each of them in the specific way that being truly present with another person matters when it is rare. They sat for an hour and rose and bowed to the garden she had tended and left. The hum was strong in the way that presence is strong when it is fully attended to. Sora had been apprenticed to her grandmother since she was old enough to sit still in a field, and she had learned the work the way garden work is learned, through doing it alongside someone who had been doing it longer, until the doing becomes natural enough to continue without instruction. She did not feel like a keeper of anything except the soil and the seeds and the visiting beings who arrived needing somewhere to be received. The garden tended the silence. The silence tended whatever else needed tending. That was how it had always worked, and she saw no reason to revise the arrangement. The screamers arrived in the galaxy's awareness not gradually, but all at once. As species that emerge from rifts rather than from ordinary spacefaring development tend to arrive, without the preamble of detected signals or observed expansion, present only in the sudden fact of their presence and the damage that attended it. The damage was acoustic in nature, which made it unlike anything in the existing defense frameworks, and the existing defense frameworks failed consistently because every response in the framework involved generating output, and output was what the screamers processed as sustenance. The Council's request to Veridia was shaped by desperation rather than strategy, which Sora understood when she received it, and which she addressed directly in her refusal. The silence was not deployable. It was not a counterfrequency or a suppression field or any kind of system that could be aimed. It was a condition, and conditions could be offered but not weaponized without ceasing to be the condition they were and becoming something else. And the something else would not work because the something else was not what the screamers needed. What the screamers needed was what every being that had ever arrived at Veridia needing something had needed, which was to encounter their own actual state in a space that could hold it without amplifying it. She extended the invitation and explained it plainly, and the screamers arrived with their weapons ready, because that was their available posture, and the hum met the weapons as it met everything, with the patient quality of something that has been present longer than the arriving thing and intends to remain present after it. The noise faded. The silence was just silence. In the silence, the screamers heard the sound that they had been generating so much noise to avoid hearing, which was themselves. They wept. They stayed long enough to learn that what they had been trying to communicate could be said softly. The flowers the screamers planted absorbed sound the way certain materials absorb light, and the effect was not dampening but elimination. Within the boundaries of the garden they had cultivated from their own biology, the acoustic environment dropped to a level that instruments registered as zero, and that humans experienced as something their nervous systems had no established category for. Not the quiet of a library or a field at dawn. The absence of everything that makes a location feel inhabited by physics. Visitors described it as the universe emptied of its ordinary evidence of existing. Most who tried it left quickly. The absolute absence was too large for minds accustomed to sound as a continuous confirmation that the world was present and proceeding. But those who stayed past the first panic reported something consistent with what every other form of Veridia's silence had produced, compressed and intensified by the completeness of the quiet. The stories they had been telling themselves about who they were and what they had done and why the things they had done were necessary or unavoidable became audible in the absence of the noise they had been using to avoid hearing them. The hush was the silence that showed you what the silence was full of. Elias wrote the book because the book was the right response, and because he had the particular quality of honesty that allowed him to write something that would be criticized for saying what it said without that criticism revising what he had found. True silence was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of the self-protective narration that sound enabled. What remained when the narration stopped was not comfortable. It was the foundation. He said he would rather stand on a foundation. He could not argue with an uncomfortable story he had constructed above the truth, and he meant this without qualification. The galaxy's relationship with silence changed in the way that relationships change when a sufficient number of individual experiences accumulate into a shared understanding, not through argument or policy, but through the simple weight of enough people having been in the same room with the same thing and come out the other side having found it useful. Chosen silence was different from imposed silence in the way that chosen presence was different from compelled attendance, and the difference was everything, and the galaxy was learning the difference by practicing the choice. Kale had grown up knowing about his family's history in the way that descendants of people who have done significant things grow up knowing about those things as both inheritance and weight, something that shaped his identity before he was old enough to have chosen an identity. He had arrived at Veridia carrying guilt that he had never been able to locate precisely, diffuse and persistent, a background condition of his life that he had developed workarounds for rather than examining. The hum located it for him, not by diagnosis but by reflection, and what the reflection showed him was that guilt in the form he had been carrying it was not a punishment, but a signal that his values and his history were not aligned, and that the misalignment was available to be addressed. He built the school because the school was what he knew how to build, and because the question the hum had shown him required a practical answer rather than a philosophical one. 90 students graduated from the first class and went into the galaxy as people who had learned to sit still with themselves, which was the foundational skill for every other skill the galaxy most needed. None of them became soldiers. Kale did not consider this a restriction. He considered it the natural outcome of people who had learned to hear themselves. The academy expanded because the demand expanded, which was itself evidence of something the founding had been premised on, that the skill of sitting with yourself and listening was not a niche capacity for the philosophically inclined, but a fundamental competency that any being in any context could use, and that most beings had never been taught because the teaching required someone who had learned it first. The graduates who went out to fill roles the galaxy had always needed, but had been filling poorly became the source of the next generation of teachers, and the branching accumulated into something that looked from a sufficient distance like an institution, and from the inside like a community of people who had found the same useful thing and kept returning to it. Kale gave the interview in the garden where the academy had started, which was also where his grandmother's grandmother had first sat with a human and learned what a mirror could do. The journalist asked her questions, and he answered them with the directness of someone who has been sitting with himself long enough that the presenting version and the actual version are the same version. The secret, he told her, was the absence of a secret. Silence offered freely said one thing, and the thing it said was the most valuable thing one being could say to another, which was that the other was worth attending to. The journalist's article circulated further than any piece of galactic journalism had circulated before it, and the reason it circulated was the reason that Elias had said truth was the only foundation for peace, which was that truth, when someone bothered to say it plainly, was recognizable to everyone who received it. Veridia had not been a human world for several generations by the time the Gardens completed their coverage of the landmass, and the completion was not a boundary being reached so much as a condition being recognized. The planet had been tending toward this for as long as anyone had been paying attention, and the final patches of unplanted ground between the older gardens filled in gradually rather than all at once, the way a sentence completes itself when the last word arrives, and the meaning that had been assembling across all the previous words becomes clear. The beings who lived on Veridia were the children and grandchildren of everyone who had come and stayed, which over several generations of arrivals from across the galaxy had produced a population that was no longer describable as any single species world. The Kryth who had come bearing shame, and the Screamers who had come bearing noise, and the Veth, and the Zarth, and the dozens of others who had come bearing whatever they had been carrying. Their descendants sat in the same gardens their ancestors had sat in, and felt the same hum their ancestors had felt, and were continuous with the place in the way that people become continuous with places when the places have shaped them across enough generations. The child born to the Kryth mother and the human father was asking the question in the way that children ask questions when they are genuinely curious rather than performing curiosity, and her parents answered in the way that people answer questions when the answer is something they have lived rather than something they have been told. The door went everywhere, her father said, and nowhere, and here. The child filed this in the category of things that were true without being immediately useful and would become useful later, and went back to what she had been doing, which was sitting in the garden listening to the hum with the uncomplicated attention of someone for whom the hum had always been the background of existing. 1,000 years produced a galaxy that was recognizable as continuous with what had come before and different in the ways that matter most, which are not the structural ways that historians chart, but the habitual ways that only become visible when you compare the ordinary behavior of ordinary beings across sufficient time. When conflicts arose now, the first impulse was not to calculate advantage or assemble force, but to find a quiet enough space to hear what the conflict was actually about. And this impulse had become ordinary in the way that impulses become ordinary when enough generations have grown up with them as the available response. It was not perfect. It was not always. It was more often than before, and more often was the only realistic target, and also it turned out sufficient. The hum had long since stopped being a subject of scientific investigation, not because scientists had given up, but because the investigation had revealed something that changed what investigation meant in this context. The hum was not measurable because it was not a phenomenon independent of the beings experiencing it. It was relational, which meant it existed in the space between the planet and the person rather than in either one alone, and that space was not accessible to instruments that could only measure what was in front of them. The scientists who continued studying Veridia studied the effects rather than the cause, and the effects were well documented and consistent, and continued to resist any explanation that did not include the word belief as a load-bearing term. Lyra had spent her career in the Veridia archives and had emerged with a book that did what good historical scholarship does, which is show how the present arrived from the past in a way that makes the present legible. Her final paragraph circulated through the galaxy's networks with the velocity of things that say plainly something that people have been understanding imprecisely, and the sentence that traveled furthest was the one about invitation, because invitation was the word that named the difference between what Veridia had done and what every empire in the archive had done, and the difference was the whole story. The garden's expansion had long since passed the point where any individual could hold the whole of it in mind, and the people who tended it had stopped trying to maintain a comprehensive picture and instead tended the sections they knew, which were large enough to occupy a life and small enough to be known well. The living library aspect had developed without anyone deciding it should develop that way. Visitors had started bringing seeds, and the humans had accepted the seeds and planted them and added the small plaques as a practical matter of record-keeping, and the record-keeping had accumulated into an archive that was also a landscape that was also, in some sense that the linguists continued to debate, a language. The young screamer born on Veridia was the first of his species to grow up never having known his species' original relationship with noise, which meant he experienced silence not as an achievement or a transformation, but as the ordinary condition of existing, the way any child experiences the conditions into which they are born as simply the way things are. He had questions about the garden's design because he had the particular quality of attention that comes from growing up in a place rather than arriving at it, which attends to different things than the attention of an arrival. The elder answered without making the answer into an occasion, which was the teaching style Veridia had developed across 1,000 years of receiving people who needed to learn things, not lecture, not demonstration, but the sharing of something true in ordinary language in response to a genuine question. Trust was staying, she said. Not the performance of staying, not the announced intention to stay, but the actual physical fact of remaining present with someone without requiring the presence to produce anything in particular. The flowers were evidence of this. They had been planted by people who stayed. Kale closed his eyes, and the hum received him as it received everyone. Kale grew into his work the way people grow into work that was waiting for them, not by becoming something different, but by becoming more fully what he already was, which in his case was someone who had been born into silence and found it natural, and therefore had no difficulty offering it to others as the straightforward gift it was rather than the rare and effortful achievement that most beings who offered it had arrived at through considerable work. His method was simple, because simplicity was the method. Come to the garden. Sit. The rest was the hum's business. The Zorn and Veth case was documented in detail, because a journalist had accompanied the delegation, hoping to witness the failure that everyone in the galactic diplomatic community was predicting, and the journalist had been present for the shouting and the sitting and the gradual fading of the shouting, and had recorded what happened with the specificity of someone who understood that what they were witnessing was not going to be believed on summary, and needed the detail to be credible. The misunderstanding that had sustained 3,000 years of war was the kind that sounds small in retrospect, and was not small in the living of it, a miscommunication in a treaty negotiation in the 3rd century that had been responded to as betrayal, and had never been correctly identified as error, because the error had immediately been buried under the responses to it, which had generated more responses, accumulating into a structure of grievance that neither side remembered building but that both sides had been maintaining. The hum showed each leader the structure from outside. They saw it at the same time. Kale sat in the garden after the signing and felt the hum's quality and returned to what he had always been doing, which was all he wanted. The story arrives back where it started, which is what all true circular stories do, not to suggest that nothing has changed, but to show that the thing that mattered was always there, available, and that what changed was the willingness to receive it. Veridia was the same planet with the same slow rivers and the same gentle forests and the gardens that had grown from a single human colony's decision to carve one word into the earth rather than fire a weapon. The word was still true. 1,000 years had not made it less true. They had made more beings capable of hearing it. The child born on the anniversary was named for the elder who had first spoken to the Kryth, which was a form of continuity that Veridia had developed over the centuries, names passing forward not as possessions, but as acknowledgments that a life had been worth continuing in the people who came after. She grew up in the garden in the way that children grow up in places they are born into, which is unconsciously and thoroughly, the place becoming part of the structure of how the world works before they have the perspective to see it as a particular place rather than simply everywhere. When she was old enough to ask the question, her mother gave the answer she had carried for the length of her own life in Veridia's gardens. The silence was the space between words, she said. It was where truth lived when it was not being covered by the noise that people generated when they were afraid of what truth might say. Veridia was that space made available, offered as a possibility rather than imposed as a requirement, existing as long as the choosing continued. The child put the white flower in her hair with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who knows where they are. She closed her eyes. The hum received her. It had no words. It did not need any. Presence was the language that every being spoke before they learned to speak anything else, and Veridia had simply been offering, for 1,000 years, the conditions in which that first language could be heard again.